Marcus Reed sat in the third row of the history classroom at Meridian Academy, watching Professor Thamo prepare for the morning lecture. The tall crystalline being moved gracefully between the holographic displays, his transparent body catching the light from the artificial suns that lit the massive space station. Around Marcus, students from dozens of different species filled the curved amphitheater seats, their various breathing apparatus and environmental suits creating a symphony of soft, mechanical sounds. The Academy was famous throughout the galaxy for bringing together the brightest minds from every known civilization. Marcus felt honored to be here as part of the first major human exchange program with the Galactic Confederation. He had worked hard to earn his place, studying xenobiology and galactic history for years before being selected. His specialty was comparative historical analysis, and he was particularly interested in how different species approached conflict resolution. Professor Thamo began the lecture with his usual melodic voice that resonated through the crystal formations on his head. Today's topic was the Great Pacification Wars, a series of conflicts that had supposedly brought lasting peace to the galaxy 800 years ago. Marcus had read about these wars in the standard galactic textbooks, though he found some of the historical accounts rather simplified. The Great Pacification began when the civilized species of the inner systems encountered the barbarian races of the outer rim, Professor Thamo explained, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. These primitive beings had no understanding of proper warfare or diplomatic resolution. They fought with crude weapons and savage tactics that shocked the civilized galaxy. Marcus shifted in his seat, his datapad showing notes he had compiled from human historical databases. The official galactic version of events seemed to differ significantly from what he had found in Earth's archives. He raised his hand politely. "Professor, I have some questions about the timeline you mentioned," Marcus said. "According to the records I've studied, the Outer Rim species were actually more technologically advanced in several key areas, particularly in defensive systems and logistics." Professor Thamo's crystalline features flickered with what might have been annoyance. "Mr. Reed, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but the historical record is quite clear. The Outer Rim barbarians were primitive in every meaningful way. They had no concept of civilized warfare." "What exactly do you mean by civilized warfare?" Marcus asked, his voice remaining calm and curious. "Well, obviously," Professor Thamo replied, gesturing to the holographic display showing artistic representations of ancient battles. Civilized species understand that conflict should be limited. You engage in ceremonial combat, you target military installations only, you avoid civilian populations, and you surrender when your opponent demonstrates clear superiority. The barbarians did none of these things. Marcus looked down at his datapad, then back up at the professor. "Could you give me some specific examples of what the Outer Rim species did that was considered barbaric?" Professor Thamo's light patterns shifted to what Marcus had learned indicated enthusiasm for the topic. "Certainly. The Terran barbarians, for example, were notorious for their brutal tactics. They would continue fighting even when clearly defeated. They targeted supply lines instead of engaging in honorable direct combat. They used something called scorched earth tactics, which was considered absolutely horrific by civilized standards." The classroom was quiet except for the gentle humming of life support systems. Marcus felt a familiar tension building in his chest, the same feeling he got when he encountered historical inaccuracies in his research. "Professor, I think there might be some confusion in the historical records," Marcus said carefully. "The scorched earth tactic you mentioned is actually a defensive strategy used to deny resources to an invading force. It's typically employed by a defending population against a superior enemy. From a tactical standpoint, it's quite logical." "Logical?" Professor Thamo's voice rose several octaves. "Mr. Reed, deliberately destroying your own infrastructure to spite an enemy is the behavior of madmen, not logical beings." Marcus stood up slowly, his movement causing several nearby students to look up from their note-taking. Kelvin, an equerry student whose tentacles were always in motion, turned his large eyes toward the human. Buzz, the hive mind representative, clicked his mandibles softly. Lyra, an ethereal whose translucent form seemed to glow with inner light, floated slightly, higher in her specialized chair. "Professor," Marcus said, his voice still calm but carrying a new weight, "I think the issue here is that you're applying your species' understanding of warfare to a completely different context. Scorched Earth isn't about spite. It's about survival. When your enemy is planning to use your own resources to destroy more of your people, denying them those resources becomes a moral imperative." The classroom had gone completely silent. Even the environmental system seemed to quiet. "Let me give you a better example," Marcus continued, pulling up data on his pad. "On Earth, we had a conflict called the Second World War. One nation attempted to conquer most of the planet and systematically exterminate entire populations. The defending nations used every tactical advantage they could find, including scorched earth strategies, because the alternative was the complete destruction of their civilizations." Professor Thimmel's crystal formations were now flickering rapidly. "Mr. Reed, you're describing a theoretical scenario that could never occur in reality. No civilized species would attempt planetary conquest or population extermination." "It's not theoretical," Marcus replied quietly. "It happened. Multiple times, actually. Earth's history is full of conflicts where surrender meant death or slavery for entire populations. In those situations, what you call barbaric tactics become necessary survival tools." Marcus activated his datapad's holographic display, showing a map of Europe during the 1940s. This particular conflict involved most of the major powers on Earth. The casualty count was approximately 50 million people. The defending nations had to develop tactics that your galactic civilization would consider war crimes just to survive. The silence in the room was now complete. Marcus could see Professor Thimmel's form beginning to dim, which he had learned indicated stress in crystalline beings. "But that's not even the interesting part," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone of an academic discussing a fascinating research topic. "The really remarkable thing is how Earth's nations learned from these conflicts. They developed something called the Geneva Conventions, which established rules for warfare that protect civilians and prisoners. They created the concept of war crimes and built international courts to prosecute violations." Kelvin's tentacles had gone completely still. Buzz's clicking had stopped entirely. Lyra's glow was flickering erratically. "You see," Marcus said, warming to his subject, "humans didn't develop these brutal tactics because we're naturally savage. We developed them because we learned that sometimes the only way to protect civilization is to be willing to destroy everything to defend it. The phrase we use is total war, and it means that when your enemy threatens your very existence, every resource, every person, every possible advantage becomes part of the conflict." Professor Thimmel's form was now barely visible, his light patterns chaotic and dim. "Mr. Reed, I think we should perhaps move on to another topic." "Of course, Professor," Marcus said pleasantly, sitting back down. "I just wanted to make sure the historical record was accurate. After all, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it." The remainder of the class passed in absolute silence. When the session ended, 3 students had to be escorted to the Medical Center for Stress-Induced Trauma. Professor Thimmel immediately filed for transfer to another sector of the galaxy. Marcus was escorted to the dean's office by security drones, still carrying his datapad and looking genuinely puzzled by the reaction. His comments had received dot as he walked through the corridors of Meridian Academy. Marcus couldn't help but wonder why his fellow students and professor had seemed so disturbed by what he considered basic historical analysis. He had been careful to present the information in an academic context, focusing on the logical development of tactical doctrine rather than the emotional aspects of warfare. He had even included examples of how humans had learned to regulate and limit conflict through international law. The security drones flanking him remained silent, their sensors constantly monitoring his vital signs and stress levels. Marcus wasn't stressed, just confused. He had thought that sharing Earth's historical experiences would contribute to the galactic understanding of conflict resolution. Instead, he seemed to have caused some kind of diplomatic incident. As they approached the dean's office, Marcus reviewed his notes one more time, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. The information he had shared was readily available in any comprehensive historical database. The tactical concepts he had mentioned were standard military doctrine that any species with a history of conflict would have developed. The Geneva Conventions and international law were examples of how civilized beings learned to limit the destructive potential of warfare. He genuinely couldn't understand why his classmates had reacted with such horror to what he considered a fascinating example of how intelligent beings could learn from their mistakes and develop better ways of resolving conflicts. After all, wasn't that the whole point of studying history in the first place? Dean Vorthak had seen many crises during his 40 years of service at Meridian Academy, but nothing had prepared him for the emergency council meeting he was now forced to convene. The oval chamber deep within the Academy's administrative center buzzed with tension as representatives from the major galactic species took their seats around the central holographic display. Each being present represented not just their academic department, but their entire civilization's approach to education and interspecies relations. Admiral Corex of the Reptilian Defense Force sat rigidly in his environmental suit, his scaled features visible through the transparent aluminum faceplate. Despite his military background, Corex was known throughout the galaxy as a peace-loving being who had never fired a weapon in anger. His presence at an academic institution was meant to bridge the gap between military and civilian perspectives. On conflict resolution. Sage Melody from the Pacifist Collective floated in her specialized meditation chamber, her gas form shimmering with calming blue patterns. The Pacifist Collective had not engaged in warfare for over 2,000 years, having evolved beyond the need for physical conflict. Their contribution to galactic civilization was their advanced understanding of diplomatic resolution and emotional harmony. Dr. Helix, the Academy's chief psychologist, had arrived with a massive datapad containing preliminary reports from the medical center. His insectoid form clicked nervously as he reviewed the psychological evaluations of the students who had been affected by what was now being called the Reed incident. Dean Vorthak activated the central display showing the classroom recording from Professor Thimel's history class. The audio had been filtered to remove the emotional resonance that had affected the original witnesses, but even the sanitized version was disturbing to watch. Marcus Reed, appearing completely calm and academically focused, systematically described warfare concepts that violated every principle of civilized conflict resolution. "Gentlemen, colleagues," Dean Vorthak began, his voice carrying the weight of administrative authority, "we have a situation that threatens the fundamental principles upon which this academy was founded. A single human student has managed to traumatize an entire classroom simply by discussing his species' historical experiences." Admiral Corex leaned forward in his chair, his military training evident in his posture. "Dean, I've reviewed the transcript of Mr. Reed's statements. He made no threats, used no aggressive language, and presented his information in an academic context. Yet 3 students are now receiving psychological treatment for what our medical staff is calling conceptual warfare trauma. That's precisely the problem." Dr. Helix interrupted, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "Mr. Reed didn't threaten anyone because he didn't need to. His casual discussion of human warfare concepts was more psychologically devastating than any direct threat could have been. The affected students report feeling as though they had been exposed to existential horror simply by hearing him describe tactical doctrine." Sage Melody's form shifted to deeper blue patterns, indicating deep contemplation. "Perhaps we should examine what Mr. Reed actually said. Could you replay the section where he discusses this total war concept?" Dean Vorthak manipulated the display, showing the moment when Marcus had explained the human approach to existential conflicts. Even with the emotional filters active, the representatives around the table shifted uncomfortably, as the human calmly described warfare as a complete commitment of all resources and population to the goal of survival. "Notice his tone," Dr. Helix observed. He discusses the destruction of entire continents with the same academic detachment that I might use to describe cellular biology. To him, these are simply historical facts to be analyzed and understood. But surely, Admiral Corex sighed, this is merely one human's perspective. Perhaps Mr. Reed has some kind of psychological disorder that makes him unusually focused on violent concepts. Dr. Helix activated his own display, showing psychological profiles of the other human students at the Academy. That's what I thought, initially. However, our evaluation of the other 23 humans currently enrolled shows similar patterns. They all possess detailed knowledge of warfare concepts that would be classified as forbidden tactical doctrine by every civilized species. The display showed brain scans and psychological evaluations. Amy Chan, a quiet archaeology student, had casually mentioned during her interview that her grandfather had participated in only 3 or 4 wars, and that this was considered a peaceful generation in human history. Robert Kim, studying diplomatic relations, had offhandedly referenced battlefield tactics that would constitute genocide-level warfare by galactic standards. The most disturbing aspect, Dr. Helix continued, is that these humans are not aberrations. They represent the normal range of human historical knowledge. According to our analysis, any adult human possesses warfare concepts that would require specialized military clearance for other species to even study. Sage Melody's pattern shifted to a worried yellow. Are you suggesting that humans are naturally violent? That would contradict everything we know about their behavior since joining the Galactic Confederation. That's the paradox, Dean Vorthek replied, activating another display showing human behavior patterns at the Academy. The humans are among our most peaceful, cooperative, and friendly students. They participate in charity drives, help struggling classmates, and have formed genuine friendships across species lines. Their social behavior is exemplary. Admiral Corex studied the data with growing confusion. How is this possible? In my experience, beings who possess detailed knowledge of warfare tactics typically display aggressive or territorial behaviors. These psychological profiles suggest that humans are simultaneously the most warfare knowledgeable and most peace-loving species we've encountered. Dr. Helix clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. I believe the answer lies in something Mr. Reed mentioned during his impromptu lecture. He referenced something called the Geneva Conventions, which appear to be human-developed rules for limiting warfare. Our research indicates that humans have created extensive legal and ethical frameworks specifically designed to constrain their own capacity for violence. Let me understand this correctly, Sage Melody said, her form now pulsing with nervous energy. Humans have developed comprehensive knowledge of warfare not because they enjoy conflict, but because they understand exactly how destructive they can be? That appears to be the case, Dr. Helix confirmed. Our analysis suggests that human warfare knowledge developed as a survival mechanism. They studied conflict extensively because they needed to understand how to prevent it, not because they wanted to engage in it. Dean Vorthek leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the situation. This presents us with an unprecedented challenge. We cannot simply expel the humans from the Academy. They are here under official diplomatic exchange programs. Moreover, their academic performance is exceptional, and they contribute positively to the campus community. But we also cannot continue to expose other species to human perspectives on warfare without proper preparation, Admiral Corex added. The psychological trauma experienced by the students in Professor Thummel's class demonstrates that most galactic civilizations are not equipped to process human historical experiences. Dr. Helix pulled up additional data on his display. I've been conducting research on human educational systems. It appears that human children are routinely exposed to historical accounts of warfare as part of their standard education. They learn about these conflicts in the same way that other species learn about art or literature. What are you suggesting? Sage Melody asked. I'm suggesting that humans have developed psychological mechanisms for processing warfare information that other species lack. They can discuss tactics and strategies that would traumatize us, because they've been culturally conditioned to view these concepts as historical learning tools rather than active threats. Dean Vorthak considered the implications. So we're dealing with a species that has effectively weaponized their own education system, not for aggression, but for prevention. In essence, yes, Dr. Helix confirmed. Humans appear to believe that the best way to avoid warfare is to understand it completely. This is a fundamentally alien concept to every other species in the galaxy. Admiral Korex straightened in his chair. Then we need to find a way to bridge this gap. The humans have knowledge and perspectives that could be valuable for galactic peace efforts, but we need to find a way to translate their insights without traumatizing other species. What do you propose? Dean Vorthak asked. A compromise, Admiral Korex replied. We implement a war counselor program. Any human attending classes that might touch on historical conflicts will be assigned a counselor trained in both human psychology and galactic diplomatic norms. The counselor can help translate human perspectives into concepts that other species can process without psychological trauma. Sage Melodi's form brightened to a hopeful green. That could work. The counselor would serve as both a cultural interpreter and a psychological buffer. Dr. Helix nodded his agreement. I can begin developing training protocols for the counselors immediately. We'll need beings with military backgrounds who can understand human warfare concepts without being overwhelmed by them. Dean Vorthak looked around the council table. Are we all in agreement? We implement the War Counselor program as a pilot project, starting with Mr. Reed and the other human students currently enrolled in history courses. The council members indicated their agreement through their species' respective methods. Admiral Korex stood at attention. Sage Melody pulsed with bright blue patterns, and Dr. Helix clicked his mandibles in a rhythm that indicated satisfaction. Very well, Dean Vorthak concluded. I'll begin implementation immediately. Admiral Korex, can you recommend someone from your staff who might be suitable for the first counselor position? I have just the person, Admiral Korex replied. Sergeant Nova from the Peaceful Warrior caste of the Stellan species. She has extensive military training but comes from a culture that values restraint and diplomatic resolution. She should be able to understand human warfare concepts without being traumatized by them. As the council members began to disperse, Dr. Helix approached Dean Vorthak with a final observation. Dean, I think we may be witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans may be the first species to develop a complete understanding of warfare specifically for the purpose of avoiding it. If we can learn to properly interpret their knowledge, they might become the galaxy's most effective peacekeepers. Dean Vorthak nodded thoughtfully. Let's hope Sergeant Nova is up to the challenge. Something tells me that monitoring human students is going to be more difficult than any of us anticipate. Sergeant Nova had approached her new assignment with the confidence of a military professional who had spent 30 years in the Stellan Peaceful Warrior caste. Her species had developed a unique philosophy that combined military training with deep commitment to conflict prevention. Stellan warriors were taught to understand warfare so completely that they could identify and prevent conflicts before they began. She had served in diplomatic missions across the galaxy, helping to resolve territorial disputes and resource conflicts without violence. The War Counselor program seemed like a natural fit for her skills. Monitor human students during history classes, help translate their perspectives for other species, and ensure that discussions of warfare remained academic rather than traumatic. How difficult could it be to manage a few enthusiastic young beings who had read too many military history books? Nova's first session monitoring Marcus Reed and two other human students completely shattered her assumptions about the assignment. She had positioned herself in the observation booth overlooking Professor Themel's replacement classroom, equipped with psychological monitoring equipment and communication devices that would allow her to intervene if the discussion became too intense for the other students. Amy Chun sat quietly in the front row, her archaeology textbooks neatly arranged on her desk. She appeared to be a model student, taking careful notes and rarely speaking unless asked a direct question. Robert Kim, the diplomatic studies major, was reviewing what appeared to be treaty documents on his datapad. Marcus Reed sat in his usual spot, looking attentive but relaxed. The substitute professor, Dr. Milliam, was an elderly being from the contemplative order, who had volunteered to teach the history course via hologram from a safe distance of several star systems. His translucent form flickered slightly as he began the day's lesson on ancient conflict resolution techniques. Today we'll examine the Meridian Accords, which establish the framework for peaceful resolution of territorial disputes, Dr. Milliam announced. These accords represented a breakthrough in civilized diplomatic practice, demonstrating how intelligent beings could resolve conflicts without resorting to violence. Nova monitored the vitals of the non-human students in the classroom. Everything appeared normal. The human students were listening politely, occasionally taking notes. Marcus raised his hand. "Professor, I have a question about the enforcement mechanisms in the Meridian Accords. How were the agreements actually implemented when one party refused to comply?" Dr. Milliam's form brightened with what Nova recognized as academic enthusiasm. "Excellent question, Mr. Reed. The beauty of the Meridian Accords was that they included built-in incentives for compliance. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and social pressure were sufficient to ensure that all parties honored their agreements. But what happened when those measures failed? Amy Chun asked quietly, looking up from her notes. According to the historical records, the Meridian system worked for about 200 years before the first major violation. Nova felt a slight chill as she watched the human students' body language. They weren't being aggressive or confrontational, but there was something in their tone that suggested they were leading the discussion toward a specific point. "Well," Dr. Milliam replied, "the violations were minor and were resolved through extended diplomatic negotiation. The important thing is that the framework prevented any major conflicts." Robert Kim looked up from his datapad. "Professor, I've been reading the original treaty documents, and I noticed that the Meridian Accords included provisions for something called enforcement actions. Could you explain what those were?" Dr. Milliam's form flickered with what Nova recognized as discomfort. "Those were theoretical provisions that were never implemented. The framers of the Accords included them as a precaution, but civilized beings naturally preferred diplomatic solutions." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "The enforcement actions weren't theoretical, Professor. They were used at least 17 times during the Meridian period. The most significant implementation was during the Outer Rim Crisis, when the Confederation authorized military intervention to prevent what they classified as genocide." The classroom had gone quiet. Nova checked her monitoring equipment and saw that the stress levels of the non-human students were beginning to rise. "Mr. Reed," Dr. Milliam said carefully, "I think you may be confusing the Meridian Accords with some other historical event. The Confederation has never authorized military intervention." "Actually," Amy Chun said, her voice still soft but now carrying an edge of academic precision, "the Confederation authorized military intervention 43 times during the Meridian period. Most of the interventions were what humans would call police actions, but at least 12 involved what we would classify as actual warfare." Nova felt her own stress levels beginning to climb. The human students were discussing galactic history with the same casual tone they might use to discuss lunch plans, but they were describing events that contradicted everything she had learned about civilized conflict resolution. "The interesting thing," Robert Kim added, "is that the Meridian system actually worked because it included credible threats of force. The diplomatic solutions were effective because everyone knew that the Confederation would use military power if necessary." Dr. Milliam's holographic form was now flickering erratically. "Students, I think we should perhaps move on to another topic. The theoretical aspects of enforcement are not really relevant to understanding diplomatic success." "But, Professor," Marcus said, "the enforcement aspects are the most important part. Without them, the Meridian Accords were just suggestions. The reason the system worked was that it combined diplomatic incentives with military deterrence. Nova watched in fascination and growing horror as Marcus activated his datapad and began displaying tactical analyses of the Confederation's military interventions. His presentation was academically rigorous, well-researched, and absolutely terrifying. Take the Outer Rim crisis, Marcus continued, apparently oblivious to the effect his words were having on his audience. The Confederation faced a situation where diplomatic pressure had failed and economic sanctions were ineffective. They had to choose between allowing systematic population displacement or implementing military intervention. Amy Chung nodded thoughtfully. The decision tree was actually quite straightforward from a strategic perspective. The Confederation calculated that limited military action would result in fewer casualties than allowing the crisis to continue. Nova realized she was gripping her chair with enough force to leave permanent marks. The human students were discussing the deliberate use of military force as a policy tool with the same analytical detachment that other species used to discuss weather patterns. The really interesting aspect, Robert Kim said, is how the Confederation managed to limit the scope of the intervention. They used what military theorists call graduated response, applying just enough force to achieve their objectives without triggering a broader conflict. Nova activated her emergency communication device. Medical team to classroom 7. We have a developing situation. Dr. Milliam's holographic form was now barely visible. Students, I really think we should end today's discussion here. Of course, Professor, Marcus said pleasantly. But I think it's important to understand that the Meridian Accords worked precisely because they included realistic enforcement mechanisms. The combination of diplomatic engagement and military deterrence created a stable framework for conflict prevention. Nova watched as 3 alien students quietly left the classroom, their various breathing apparatus working overtime to manage their stress responses. The remaining students sat in stunned silence, apparently overwhelmed by the casual way the humans had discussed the deliberate use of military force as a diplomatic tool. After the class ended, Nova found herself in the unusual position of requiring psychological support from Dr. Helix, the Academy's chief. Psychologist listened patiently as she described what she had experienced in the classroom. The humans weren't being aggressive, Nova explained, her voice shaking slightly. They were being helpful. They genuinely thought they were contributing to academic discussion by providing historical context and strategic analysis. But the way they discussed warfare, the casual tone they used when describing military interventions, it was like listening to someone describe genocide as a policy option. Dr. Helix clicked his mandibles sympathetically. This is exactly what we were afraid of. The humans have developed a completely alien relationship with warfare concepts. They can discuss tactics and strategies that would constitute war crimes for other species because they view them as historical learning tools. But that's not the worst part, Nova continued. The worst part is that they're right. Their analysis of the Meridian Accords was historically accurate. The enforcement provisions were used and they were effective. The humans have identified aspects of galactic history that we've collectively chosen to ignore or forget. Dr. Helix reviewed his notes from the session. What you're describing is cognitive warfare. The humans aren't trying to threaten or intimidate anyone. They're simply sharing their understanding of how conflict resolution actually works. But their understanding is so alien to our way of thinking that exposure to it causes psychological trauma. Nova leaned back in her chair, feeling exhausted. Doctor, I've spent my entire career studying conflict prevention. I've been trained to understand warfare from every conceivable angle. But listening to those human students discuss military intervention as a routine diplomatic tool, it made me realize that I don't understand warfare at all. What do you mean? Dr. Helix asked. I mean that my species, like every other species in the galaxy, has developed ways of thinking about conflict that deliberately avoid the most disturbing implications. We study warfare as an aberration, something that happens when civilization breaks down. The humans study warfare as a normal part of political interaction. They understand it as a tool that can be used responsibly or irresponsibly, effectively or ineffectively. Dr. Helix processed this information. Are you saying that the humans have a more realistic understanding of warfare than we do? I'm saying that the humans have a complete understanding of warfare, while the rest of us have a sanitized understanding that makes us feel better about ourselves but doesn't actually prepare us for reality. Nova looked out the window at the Academy's peaceful gardens where students from dozens of species studied together in harmony. Doctor, what if the humans are right? What if our approach to conflict resolution only works because we live in a galaxy where the most warfare-capable species have agreed to limit themselves? What happens when we encounter a species that hasn't made that choice? Dr. Helix considered the implications. That's a disturbing thought, Sergeant. Are you suggesting that the humans might be necessary for galactic security? I'm suggesting that the humans might be the only species in the galaxy that truly understands what galactic security requires. The rest of us are living in a peaceful bubble that exists because beings like the humans are willing to think about the unthinkable. Nova stood up, feeling steadier but somehow changed by her experience. I need to continue with this assignment, Doctor. Not because I want to, but because I think the galaxy needs to understand what the humans are trying to teach us, even if it's terrifying. As she left Dr. Helix's office, Nova realized that the War Counselor program had already succeeded in ways that its creators had never intended. She was no longer just monitoring human students to protect other species from their perspectives. She was beginning to understand that the humans might be the teachers, and the rest of the galaxy might be the students, who needed to learn some very difficult lessons about the nature of peace and conflict. Dr. Helix had begun what he privately called the Human Study 3 weeks after the War Counselor program's implementation. What started as routine psychological evaluation had evolved into the most comprehensive xenopsychological research project in galactic history. The data he was collecting challenged every assumption the galaxy had made about the relationship between intelligence, civilization, and warfare. The breakthrough came during his interview with Marcus Reed, conducted in the Academy's Neutral Zone Psychology Lab. Marcus sat comfortably in the standard humanoid chair, apparently unaware that his casual responses were revolutionizing galactic understanding of human nature. Marcus, Dr. Helix began, his mandibles clicking softly as he reviewed his notes. I'd like to understand something about human education. You mentioned that you learned about warfare tactics in what you call elementary school. Could you explain what that means? Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Well, elementary school is basic education for children ages 6 to 12. We learn reading, writing, mathematics, and basic history. The history curriculum includes major conflicts like the American Civil War, World War I, World War II, and other significant events. And children at age 6 are taught about warfare? Dr. Helix asked, his voice carefully neutral. Not warfare tactics specifically, Marcus clarified. More like the causes and consequences of major conflicts. By age 10 or 11, we might learn about basic strategy and tactics, but it's presented as historical analysis rather than military training. Dr. Helix made notes on his datapad. What was your emotional response to learning about these conflicts as a child? Marcus considered the question carefully. I remember being sad about the casualties and destruction. Most children have that reaction initially. But our teachers explained that studying these events helps us understand how to prevent similar conflicts in the future. Prevent them how? Dr. Helix asked. By understanding the underlying causes, the decision-making processes that led to escalation, and the tactical factors that determined outcomes. If you understand how conflicts develop and unfold, you can identify warning signs and intervene before they become violent. Dr. Helix felt a familiar chill as he processed this information. Marcus, are you telling me that human children are taught military history specifically to prevent warfare? Exactly, Marcus replied, seeming pleased that Dr. Helix understood. The whole point of studying war is to avoid having to fight one. That's why we developed concepts like deterrence theory, arms control agreements, and international law. We learned that the best way to prevent conflicts is to understand them. Completely. Dr. Helix activated his recording device and leaned forward. Could you give me an example of how this knowledge helps prevent conflicts? Marcus thought for a moment. Well, take nuclear weapons. Humans developed the most destructive weapons in our history, capable of destroying entire planets. But we've never used them in warfare since the first two demonstrations, because we understand exactly what the consequences would be. You have weapons that can destroy planets? Dr. Helix asked, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain professional. Not planets exactly, Marcus corrected. But we could certainly destroy the biosphere of a planet, making it uninhabitable for centuries. We call it mutually assured destruction. Everyone knows that using these weapons would result in the complete annihilation of both sides, so nobody uses them. Dr. Helix realized he was having difficulty breathing properly. Marcus, how many other species know that humans possess this level of destructive capability? I'm not sure, Marcus replied. It's not classified information or anything? Any species with access to human historical databases would know about our nuclear capabilities. We've been quite open about our weapons development, since transparency is important for deterrence to work effectively. Dr. Helix excused himself from the interview and immediately contacted Dean Vorthak. Within hours, an emergency session of the Galactic Security Council was convened to address what was being called the Human Capabilities Assessment. The council chamber was filled with representatives from every major species, all reviewing the preliminary data from Dr. Helix's research. The atmosphere was tense as the implications of the human approach to warfare became clear. Admiral Corax stood at the central podium, his scaled features grim as he addressed the assembly. Colleagues, we have discovered that the humans possess weapons technology that exceeds anything in our current arsenals. More importantly, they have possessed these weapons for over 80 years without using them in conflict. A representative from the Aquari delegation raised a tentacle. Admiral, are you suggesting that the humans have been deliberately concealing their military capabilities? No, Admiral Corax replied. They haven't been concealing anything. The information has been freely available in their historical databases since they joined the Confederation. We simply didn't understand what we were looking at. Sage Melodi's form pulsed with confused patterns. How is it possible that a species possesses planet-destroying weapons but behaves as peacefully as the humans do? Dr. Helix activated the central display, showing psychological profiles of human students. The answer lies in their approach to warfare knowledge. Humans don't develop weapons because they want to use them. They develop weapons because they understand that possessing overwhelming force can prevent conflicts from occurring. But that's completely backwards, protested a delegate from the Crystalline Confederacy. Every civilized species knows that weapons development leads to arms races and increased conflict. Not for humans, Dr. Helix explained. Human military doctrine is based on the principle that the best way to avoid fighting is to be so obviously capable of winning that your opponents choose not to fight you. They call it peace through strength. The chamber erupted in confused discussion as representatives tried to process this alien concept. Admiral Corax called for order and continued his presentation. The most disturbing aspect of our discovery, Admiral Corax said, is that the humans are not an aberration. According to their historical records, every major human nation has independently developed this approach to warfare. They have collectively agreed to limit their weapons development and military activities because they understand exactly how destructive they could be. A delegate from the Hive Collective clicked rapidly. Are you saying that human restraint is based on knowledge rather than nature? Precisely, Dr. Helix confirmed. Humans aren't naturally peaceful. They're naturally capable of extreme violence, but they've developed cultural and institutional mechanisms to control that capability. Their laws, their military doctrine, their international agreements are all designed to prevent them from using their full, destructive potential. The implications were staggering. The galaxy had welcomed humans as junior partners in galactic civilization, assuming they were a relatively primitive species that needed guidance and protection. The reality was that humans had been deliberately limiting their capabilities to avoid frightening their galactic neighbors. Dean Vorthak rose to address the council. Colleagues, we need to consider what this means for our relationship with humanity. We've been treating them as students who need to learn about civilized behavior. In reality, they may be the most sophisticated warfare prevention specialists in the galaxy. What are you suggesting? Asked a representative from the Peaceful Collective. I'm suggesting that we've been approaching the human integration process backwards, Dean Vorthak replied. Instead of teaching humans about galactic civilization, we should be learning from humans about conflict prevention. Admiral Corex nodded grimly. The humans have solved the fundamental problem of intelligent species development. They've figured out how to possess overwhelming military capability without using it. That's something no other species in the galaxy has achieved. Dr. Helix displayed additional data from his research. My interviews with human students reveal that they possess detailed knowledge of warfare tactics, strategic planning, and conflict escalation not because they're militaristic, but because they view this knowledge as essential for preventing violence. The human student Amy Chun told me that her grandfather fought in only 3 or 4 wars, and that this was considered a peaceful generation. Dr. Helix continued. When I asked her to explain, she said that previous generations had fought in more conflicts, but that humans had learned to prevent most wars through better diplomacy and deterrence. The chamber was silent as the representatives processed this information. The humans weren't just another species joining galactic civilization. They were potentially the most warfare-capable species in the galaxy who had chosen to limit themselves for the benefit of interspecies peace. Sage Melodi's form shifted to deep contemplative patterns. If this is true, then human participation in galactic affairs isn't just beneficial, it's essential. They may be the only species capable of deterring truly dangerous threats to galactic civilization. But how do we integrate this knowledge without traumatizing the rest of the galaxy? Asked a delegate from the Contemplative Order, Admiral. Corex considered the question. We need to completely restructure our approach to human integration. Instead of trying to civilize humans, we need to help them translate their knowledge into concepts that other species can understand and use. Dean Vorthak stood up. I propose that we expand the War Counselor program into a full exchange program. Instead of monitoring humans to protect other species, we should be facilitating knowledge transfer from humans to galactic institutions. You're suggesting that humans should become teachers rather than students? Asked Dr. Helix. I'm suggesting that humans may be the teachers the galaxy needs, even if we're not ready to be their students, Dean Vorthak replied. The council voted unanimously to implement the expanded program. As the representatives dispersed, Admiral Corex approached Dr. Helix with a final observation. Doctor, I think we're witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans may be the first species to develop complete mastery over their own capacity for violence. If we can learn from them, we might actually achieve the lasting peace that has eluded galactic civilization for millennia. Dr. Helix nodded thoughtfully. The question is whether the rest of the galaxy is ready to learn some very difficult lessons about the true nature of peace and conflict. The humans understand that lasting peace requires the capability for war. That's a concept that challenges everything we thought we knew about civilization. As they left the council chamber, both beings realized that the galaxy was about to undergo a fundamental transformation in how it understood the relationship between intelligence, civilization, and the prevention of warfare. The humans, it seemed, had been waiting patiently for the rest of the galaxy to catch up to their understanding of these complex issues. 6 months after the implementation of the expanded War Counselor program, Meridian Academy had transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. The corridors that had once echoed with the gentle sounds of traditional academic discussion now buzzed with intense conversations about conflict prevention, strategic deterrence, and the complex relationship between military capability and diplomatic success. Marcus Reed stood at the front of the Academy's largest lecture hall, looking out at an audience that would have been unimaginable when he first arrived as an exchange student. Representatives from every major species in the galaxy filled the curved amphitheater, their various breathing apparatus and environmental suits creating a symphony of focused attention. Admiral Korax sat in the front row, taking careful notes. Sage Melody floated in her meditation chamber, her form pulsing with engaged interest. Dr. Helix occupied his usual position near the recording equipment, documenting every word for the galactic archives. The fundamental principle of human conflict prevention, Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics, is that the study of warfare serves the cause of peace. This may seem contradictory to species that view military knowledge as inherently dangerous, but human history demonstrates that ignorance of warfare leads to more violence, not less. He activated the holographic display, showing a timeline of human conflicts spanning several centuries. Notice that as human understanding of warfare became more sophisticated, the frequency and scale of conflicts decreased. This wasn't an accident. It was the result of deliberate study and application of lessons learned from previous conflicts. A delegate from the Crystalline Confederacy raised a glowing appendage. Mr. Reed, how do you reconcile this with the massive casualties from human conflicts like the World Wars? Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly the point. The World Wars were catastrophic precisely because the participants didn't fully understand the implications of their weapons and tactics. The casualty levels shocked human civilization into developing better methods of conflict prevention. He changed the display to show the post-war period. After World War II, humans created the United Nations, developed nuclear deterrence theory, and established international law specifically to prevent similar conflicts. The knowledge gained from those terrible wars became the foundation for the most peaceful period in human history. Amy Chun stood up from her seat in the second row. If I may add to that, the reason human children learn about warfare is the same reason they learn about diseases. Understanding how something works is the first step in preventing it from happening. The audience stirred with interest. Amy had become an unofficial spokesperson for human perspectives on historical analysis, her quiet manner making her insights particularly effective with species that found Marcus's direct approach overwhelming. Human medical students study cancer not because they want to cause it, but because understanding its mechanisms allows them to prevent and treat it, Amy continued. Similarly, human military students study warfare not because they want to fight, but because understanding conflict dynamics allows them to prevent wars from starting. Robert Kim joined the discussion from his position near the back of the hall. The key insight is that conflict prevention requires detailed understanding of conflict escalation. You can't stop a war if you don't understand how wars begin, develop, and end. Sergeant Nova, now promoted to Director of Human Galactic Relations, activated her communication device. May I share some observations from the counselor program? Marcus nodded, gesturing for her to take the podium. Nova had become an unexpected advocate for human perspectives after her initial traumatic exposure to their way of thinking about warfare. When I first began monitoring human students, Nova began, I was horrified by their casual discussion of military tactics. It took me months to understand that their casualness came from familiarity, not from callousness. Humans discuss warfare the way other species discuss weather patterns, because they've studied it so thoroughly that it holds no mystery for them. She activated her own display, showing psychological profiles of human students. The most important discovery from our research is that humans are not naturally violent. They're naturally curious. They studied warfare because they encountered it in their history, and their response to encountering something dangerous was to understand it completely. Dr. Helix stood up from his position near the recording equipment. If I may add a psychological perspective, human warfare knowledge appears to function as a form of species-wide inoculation against conflict. By exposing themselves to detailed knowledge of warfare's consequences, they've developed cultural immunity to the factors that cause wars. The audience was completely silent, processing this revolutionary concept. Admiral Corex raised his hand for permission to speak. Dr. Helix, are you suggesting that other species could develop similar immunity through exposure to human warfare knowledge? That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Dr. Helix replied. The Counselor program has demonstrated that gradual exposure to human perspectives on conflict can help other species develop more sophisticated approaches to conflict prevention. Sage Melodi's form pulsed with excited patterns. This could revolutionize galactic peacekeeping. Instead of avoiding discussions of warfare, we could use human knowledge to prevent conflicts more effectively. Marcus returned to the podium. That's the goal of this program. Humans aren't trying to militarize galactic civilization. We're trying to share what we've learned about preventing militarization through understanding. A delegate from the Hive Collective clicked rapidly. Mr. Reed, could you give us a practical example of how human warfare knowledge could improve galactic peacekeeping? Marcus smiled, apparently pleased by the question. Certainly. Consider the current situation in the Outer Rim, where territorial disputes are creating tension between the Mineral Consortium and the Agricultural Collective. He activated a tactical display showing the disputed region. From a human perspective, this conflict is following a predictable escalation pattern. Both sides are increasing their military presence, making increasingly aggressive statements, and preparing for what they believe will be a limited conflict. The problem, Marcus continued, is that both sides are operating under the assumption that their opponents will behave rationally and limit their responses. Human military history shows that this assumption is almost always wrong. Amy Chun stood up again. What Marcus is describing is called conflict escalation dynamics. Once violence begins, both sides tend to increase their commitment rather than backing down. What starts as a limited dispute can rapidly become a full-scale war, Robert Kim nodded. The solution is to intervene before the escalation cycle begins. Human diplomatic doctrine emphasizes identifying and addressing the underlying causes of conflict before they manifest as military confrontation. Admiral Corex leaned forward. What specific interventions would you recommend? First, Marcus replied, separate the immediate trigger from the underlying causes. The Mineral Consortium and Agricultural Collective are fighting over territory, but the real issue is resource allocation. Address the resource issue, and the territorial dispute becomes negotiable. Second, Amy added, provide both sides with face-saving alternatives to military action. Human diplomacy recognizes that pride and reputation are often more important than material interests. Third, Robert concluded, establish clear consequences for escalation while providing clear benefits for cooperation. This is basic deterrence theory combined with positive incentives. Nova activated her communication device. The Counselor program has been testing these approaches with remarkable success. We've helped resolve 3 separate conflicts in the past month using human analytical frameworks. Dean Vorthak stood up from his position in the administrative section. The Academy is prepared to formalize this knowledge transfer through our new curriculum. We're establishing the Department of Human Strategic Studies with Mr. Reed as our first human faculty member. The audience erupted in what each species expressed as approval. Crystalline beings flickered with bright patterns. Aquarii tentacles waved enthusiastically, and Hive Collective representatives clicked in synchronized rhythm. Marcus looked out at the diverse assembly, remembering his first day at Meridian Academy when his simple comments about human history had traumatized an entire classroom. 6 months ago, I was assigned a war counselor because my species was considered too dangerous to discuss history without supervision. Today, we're establishing a department to teach other species what humans have learned about preventing conflicts. The irony, Amy observed, is that the War Counselor program was created to protect other species from human perspectives on warfare. Instead, it's become a program to share human perspectives on peace. Dr. Helix activated his recording equipment. For final observation, the transformation we've witnessed at Meridian Academy demonstrates something profound about the relationship between knowledge and peace. The species that understands warfare most completely may be the species most committed to preventing it. Nova stepped forward. The Academy's new motto, suggested by our human students, reflects this understanding. Those who understand war best are those who fight hardest for peace. As the session concluded, Marcus walked through the Academy's Peace Garden with his friends from different species. Kelvin, the Aquari student whose tentacles had gone still during Marcus's first traumatic lecture, now served as a teaching assistant in the Strategic Studies program. Buzz, the Hive Collective representative, had become fascinated by human decision-making processes and was writing a dissertation on individual versus collective strategic thinking. Lyra, the ethereal whose glow had flickered with distress during that first class, now helped translate human concepts into forms that energy-based species could understand. "It's strange," Kelvin observed, his tentacles moving in patterns that Marcus had learned indicated deep thought. "6 months ago, I was terrified by your casual discussion of military tactics. Now I understand that your casualness came from wisdom, not from callousness." "You weren't wrong to be terrified," Marcus replied. "Warfare is terrifying. That's why humans study it so intensively. We never want to forget how terrible it can be." A buzz clicked thoughtfully. The Hive Collective has been analyzing human conflict prevention methods. "We're impressed by your species' ability to maintain individual decision-making while coordinating collective action. That's because we learned that both individual initiative and collective coordination are necessary for effective conflict prevention," Marcus explained. "You need individuals who can think creatively about solutions, but you also need institutions that can implement those solutions consistently." Lyra's form pulsed with warm patterns. "The Energy Collective has been studying human deterrence theory. We're fascinated by your concept of credible threat. Most species either threaten everything or nothing. Humans have learned to threaten exactly enough to prevent conflicts without causing escalation." As they walked through the garden, Marcus reflected on the transformation that had occurred at Meridian Academy. The humans had come as students, eager to learn about galactic civilization. They were leaving as teachers, sharing hard-won knowledge about the most important subject of all, how intelligent beings could live together without destroying each other. "You know what the most important lesson has been?" Marcus asked his friends as they sat down near the memorial fountain dedicated to galactic peace. "What's that?" Kelvin asked. "That peace isn't the absence of conflict. Peace is the presence of justice, backed by the capability to defend it. Humans learned that lesson the hard way through centuries of warfare. We're hoping that by sharing what we learned, other species won't have to learn it the same way." Above them, the artificial stars of Meridian Academy shone down on students from dozens of species, studying together in harmony. The difference was that now they understood that their harmony was protected by beings who had learned to think carefully about what it would take to preserve it. The Academy's new motto, inscribed in the languages of every member species, glowed softly on the memorial. "Those who understand war best are those who fight hardest for peace." For the first time in galactic history, that motto was more than just idealistic hope. It was a practical reality taught by the species that had learned to turn their knowledge of warfare into humanity's greatest weapon against war itself.